Hi everyone, we're going to discuss today whether Paul did a lie in the trial before Felix. This is before Festus, and it's after the events that took place inside of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. And what happened is after the events in the Sanhedrin, there was all kinds of disputes, and people were trying to kill Paul, and the Roman tribune grabs Paul, and to save his life, takes him out of Jerusalem and brings him to Caesarea and puts him in Felix's custody. And now Felix is going to allow some of the Sanhedrin representatives to come, and they're going to send an attorney named Tertullus, and they're going to have a trial hearing in front of Felix, and Paul's going to make a presentation. So we're going to ask whether Paul lied in this particular part of his testimony, and he's basically going to talk about the law and what he believes about the law. Okay, so and this is based on a commentary or translation recommendation by MEYER. So MEYER says basically the word there, if you look in this quote in the red, is the word throughout. So he pointed out that that's the right meaning here. And it's important. Anyway, so here we go. Is this a lie? However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe in all things which are throughout the law, and that is written in the prophets. So, did he truly believe in all things which are throughout the law? So basically, look at the entire law. He believes all of it. And we're talking about the 5 books of Moses. That's all that the law is. Prophets is other material. And this is another fact we have to discuss in the context of what was the purpose of Luke. Luke's purpose is to put on a defense of Christianity for Theophilus to present at Rome to get Paul acquitted. So this book is written after he's been appealed to Caesar. In fact, it's the topic of this exchange between it's not Felix, but it'll be his successor Festus when that first happened. So that's being recorded in Acts. So it's after those events, and so clearly Luke is probably in Rome writing the finishing touches on this to present to Theophilus in order to help him help the church and not get outlawed. As Mr. Mauck, the author of this book, says, and by the way, he wrote in 2001. And he says, Luke Acts was written as a legal defense of Paul as he awaited trial before Nero and was intended to bring the gospel to Theophilus, even as he gathered facts concerning the charges against Paul. And it turns out this was the original church view, and it was revived again in 1720, and people forget about it. And so Mr. Mauck has done a good job to remind us of these facts. We've already shown you in some prior videos that there are certain things in the in the book of Acts that definitely Luke is not putting in for Christians to take and admire Paul about, and are solely designed to appeal to pagans to acquit Paul. For example, now you have to remember he's going to Rome because the charges against him included, talking against the Torah, but also that he brought in Gentiles to defile the temple. So in Acts 17:24, Paul is talking to the Athenian philosophers on Mars Hill, and he says, God does not live in temples made of human hands. And that appeals definitely to pagans because their gods live at Mount Olympus, and they don't live in temples. They may be worshipped in a ceremony that's temporary, but they don't live there. Now so this is to appeal to pagans, and is also to undermine their concern that Trophimus, Paul's friend, violated the temple grounds, because if Paul's affirming that the Jewish God doesn't live there, then there's no offense. And so what's this all about? Why do we care? So that's why this is important. It helps build the case that there's no basis to convict Paul. However, from a Christian perspective, it's completely biblically false, right? Jesus said the Father dwells in the temple. He said it twice. And then he even said one time in Mark 12:48, he said that the temple made of human hands. So it's absolutely biblically false. Why would Luke put it in there? To make Paul look bad? No, he's trying to win for Paul at trial. Same thing in Acts 16:17-18. The Python priestess for many days endorses Paul's way of salvation until Paul exorcises her demon. That's not something Christians want to know about, that demon is endorsing Paul and he's tolerating her. And in fact, she's the most popular figure of Europe. Anything she writes, and there's women who rotate this job, but they get to all have this power. their news goes all over Europe. So this was in there not to help Paul be liked by Christians, but to have Paul be endorsed by the most influential demon of the ancient world, and that was the Python priestess. And Acts 21 and Acts 20, we see that believers who were prophets kept telling Paul to not go to Jerusalem, but Paul went anyway, as my spirit constrains me. Well, that clearly is not meant for Christians, right? Because that shows him disobeying the Holy Spirit. But in the pagan world, if you could defy your God, this made you look like a hero, a Homeric figure. So they battle with their gods and they have fights with their gods, and that makes them more of a hero in pagan eyes. And what we're going to address here today is the next one of these type of facts, which are not meant for Christians to admire Paul, ironically, because we will know by the time this has been seen that Paul doesn't say this in the book of Galatians, and we'll go through what that is. But this is meant for the pagans. Why? Because the pagans actually admired the law of the Jews, and that's why it was a legal religion, and we'll get into that. So Paul affirms in this passage, I believe in all things which are in the law. Essentially, that's what he's saying. And we all know, we should know. If we don't know, we're going to go through it so you can see it with your own eyes, that he disaffirms it in Galatians for sure. And that was his first epistle. But this is crucial for Christianity to win. So even though it may prove embarrassing for Paul personally, he said it under oath. Luke put it down, and he's going to hold it to him, because this is what we need to win the trial, that we are not a new sect. We're not claiming the law has been done away with, and we now live in this new kind of religion called Christianity. I mean, that would definitely have been illegal at that time. Maybe 300 years later, when Constantine wants to use our religion, he makes us distinct and apart from the Jewish people completely, and that's what Constantine did. That's a whole nother story. Okay, I do want us to see how this is typically translated, or has been typically translated, but you'll see the consensus is this is wrong, and for some reasons it doesn't go away. So this is the NIV. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. Well, at first glance, you say, well, there's the mention of the law. It's according to it. Sounds like he's endorsing it. But does this actually mean he believes in all the truth that's not inconsistent with the law? So if it's not inconsistent with the law, he believes it. It just doesn't seem to have as much punch as you might think when you first look at it. But it doesn't say this in the Greek. Okay, and we're going to take a look at Mouncy real quick. These are the key words that we need to be looking at. Believing all things are according to the law. In this case, they made a couple of mistakes or gaps. Okay, so what are we supposed to do with this sentence? So we can see kata, according to, is the translation there, and you can see that's one of the meanings, but another meaning is throughout. And if you go over to Bible Hub, you'll see that it actually agrees that kata in this particular text, this is Bible Hub for this verse 24:14, it says throughout. Also, it reveals that Mouncy missed something. There was a word here called toius, and basically that means which, that, and whatever. So when you put it all together, believing all things, which, and now you imply the verb, and you get kata, are, throughout. You use the throughout meaning, throughout the law. I believe in everything that's throughout the entire law is essentially what he's saying. That's what it really means. And the scholar who endorsed this first was MEYER. According to the public commentary, it says, according to the law, and then it goes through that. It says may mean either in the revised version, according to the law, which is the version of the NIV, KJV, revised version, or as MEYER takes it, throughout the law. Okay, so I'm going to call this the MEYER-inspired translation. So there's the NIV in the middle. To the left is the MEYER corrected version using his concept, and then just adjusting for that. So I'm going to read it the way MEYER would have told us to read it. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way which they call a sect. I believe in all things which are throughout the law, and that is written in the prophets. And if you kind of look at some other translations, they get a little close to the same meaning as MEYER. So the NLT has, I firmly believe the Jewish law. CSB, believing in all things that are written in the law. ESV, believing everything laid down by the law. So those are closer. But MEYER has it is the first to actually give you a transliterated correct word in English for what was going on there. So we should start there. But those versions, those three versions actually reflect the same concept. So we're going to proceed based on what MEYER said. So Paul is saying, I believe in all things throughout the law. Now, what is Paul responding to? There's actually Tertullus, a lawyer for the Sanhedrin, came there, made a presentation, and one of the things he said was this in Acts 24:5. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. So he's implying they are not lawfully operating under Judaism, and they're an enemy and a troublemaker, and they're not the Christian Nazarene sect is not being recognized by Judaism, the official Judaism. Now, why is that important and very threatening? But just to finish, this is the argument made in verse 5, and Paul's response to that is this language in 24:14. He's responding and saying, I believe in all things which are throughout the law. So basically saying, don't call me a sect. We believe in the same things you do. Well, here's a very important point that's raised in BibleRef.com on Acts 24:14. Going back to that language in verse 5 of chapter 24, that Tertullus is arguing he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Why was that important to respond to? He says, or this author of this article says, in Roman law, it was highly illegal to spread a religion that was not officially sanctioned by the government. Cicero stated in De Legibus 2:8, let no one have private gods, neither new gods nor strange gods, unless publicly acknowledged, are to be worshipped privately. So you can't even have a god privately unless it's publicly acknowledged, meaning the government has said you can worship that god. And fortunately, Judaism, well, here we'll finish the sentence. Judaism was officially sanctioned, despite the fact the Romans called the Jews atheists because they have no images of their God. Funny. But anyway, that's what he's responding to. And so this is the central core of what the church is fearing. When Paul goes before Nero, if Paul comes off saying, there is no law or any of the things that are in Galatians, we're in big trouble because he's going to bury us. We'd be clearly, with his attitude, we're definitely not a sect within Judaism anymore. We're a completely new religion. You'll see exactly from Galatians. Just want to give a shout out to the commentary from Contending for the Faith, because they brought this out in this highlighted circle thing. In connecting Christianity with the Old Testament, where in that sentence, Paul avoids another charge that could have been made. He is not preaching some new, perhaps illegal religion that the Roman government would not allow. Rather, this is the way in which he worships the same God as Israel. Wow, that was important. But you'll see, does he really worship the same God of Israel? When you read Galatians, I don't think you'll think so. All right, so to repeat, the correct version is the MEYER-inspired version. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe in all things which are throughout the law, and that is written in the prophets. And now we're going to look more deeply into that. Before they do that, I just want to make a point that what Paul said in front of Agrippa in a later trial, this is after Felix is retired or passed away, I don't know which, Acts 26:19-23, Paul addresses King Agrippa, and he says, therefore, King Agrippa, having therefore obtained the help that is from God, I stand to this day testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would happen. So in this context, he's talking about just the prophecies. He's accepting the prophecies' validity that exist in the law. Now, that's not in every place, right? So, and we don't know what prophecies he's meaning in particular. Was it from the law? because there are some, at least we think so, but you're going to find out, does Paul believe any part of the Torah is inspired by God? We're going to see that in Galatians. All right, and I want to just briefly show also that all the commentary, when you boil it down, they all agree with the MEYER approach. They just don't say they're doing that. But here's the free translation from Barnes. Paul shows them that he believed only what was written in the law. Well, that's completely affirming of the law. So that's saying the same thing that the MEYER version would say. Same thing with Gill. He's saying, Paul's saying, believing all things which are written in the law. That's a free translation. He's making his own translations. That's correct. So that's back to it's Paul's accepting all of it. He's not mealy-mouthed about it. The Cambridge Bible similarly says, the apostle thus testifies to his complete acceptance of all the Jewish scriptures. Again, perfectly affirming all of it, not taking just a little part, or only those things that are consistent with it are true, as if it's not 100% true. It's 100% true is what this is the true meaning of Paul in that passage. And Smith also makes a similar free translation. He says, Paul said, I believe the prophets and the law, all of the things which are written in the law and in the prophets. So basically the same thing as the MEYER version. Ellicott's commentary, and this is a free paraphrase. His faith, Paul's faith, in all the authoritative standards of Judaism was as firm and full as that of any Pharisee. So again, 100% acceptance of the Torah validly from God is what Felix is supposed to know, is what Paul is saying, under oath, by the way, in front of the lawyers from the Sanhedrin. Okay, and now we're going to test Paul's validity against the testimony. We just need a little look at the timeline. So these events with Felix in 2414 are approximately in 57 AD, just sometime after Paul's nephew had tipped off a Roman tribune to take Paul from Jerusalem to Felix in Caesarea. So this trial is in front of Felix. Those events are recorded in Acts 22:12-22. And then we need to realize 57 AD is about 10 years from Paul's very first epistle. So the first epistle, you see over there on the left, the green box, Paul had written Galatians in 47 AD, so that's about 10 years earlier. He wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 49 to 51 AD, and then 1st and 2nd Corinthians in 53 to 56 AD. So by the time he's been arrested, which was around 57 AD in Jerusalem, he's now in Caesarea the same year. So this is about a year after the Corinthians and almost a decade after Galatians. And we're going to quote some of Galatians and some of Corinthians later. So we're going to find out what Paul's view of the law is here. Galatians 3, verse 19, Galatians 4, verses 8 to 9. So basically he says, leading up to this, if you want to obey Sabbath, O foolish Galatians, you are following the law, quote, which was ordained by the angels through the hands of a mediator, Moses. That's Galatians 3:19. Paul then says, such foolish Gentiles are desiring to submit to be in bondage to those who are no gods. The Galatians thus wrongly seek to submit to the, quote, weak and beggarly elements. And he means by that, and we'll see in the next reference, that the angels were called elements. You observe days. So what he's saying is, when they're trying to obey Sabbath, he says this was ordained by the angels through the hands of a mediator, Moses. So it came from the angels. They are no gods. And you basically should stop doing this because they are weak and beggarly elements that if you go back to trying to observe Sabbath, you are what? You are subject to the weak and beggarly elements. And so he ridicules them for observing days. And he ridicules them as fools for doing this. I just have to say, Luke 16:31, Jesus says, if they will not hear Moses, neither will they be persuaded if one rises from the dead. So Paul is undercutting the whole gospel when he does this, the resurrection of Jesus. That's what Jesus said. So this doctrine of Paul that the law was given by angels is not valid. But, I mean, it's not biblical either. But let's go on and see a little bit more on this. So let's look at Vincent's explanation of what the words elements meant in Galatians 4:9. He writes, quote, the elements of the world are the personal elemental spirits, This seems to be the preferable explanation both here and in Colossians 2:8. According to Jewish ideas, all things had their special angels. In the book of Jubilees, chapter 2, appear the angel of the presence, compare Isaiah 63:9, the angel of adoration, the spirits of the wind, the clouds, darkness, hail, frost, thunder and lightning, winter and spring, cold and heat. So that tells us the weak and beggarly elements meant to refer to the angels, which he had already just said, gave the law and are no gods. And this is his way of saying you don't have to follow this, you foolish Galatians. It's not from God. And if you think I'm misreading this, no, I'm not. And the Reformation was based on these passages in Galatians. Just so you know, Martin Luther, the reformer, did a sermon in August 27, 1525, entitled "How Christians Should Regard Moses," and he explicitly adopts what Paul's saying to say that God, the Father, did not give us the Ten Commandments, did not give us the law, did not come from him. Listen. Now the words which are here written in the law of Moses were spoken through an angel. That is not to say that only one angel was there, for there was a great multitude there serving God and preaching to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. The angel, however, who spoke here and did the talking, spoke just as if God himself were speaking and saying, I am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, Exodus 20, verse 1, as if Peter or Paul were speaking in God's stead and saying, I am your God. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul says that the law was ordained by angels. So this is why he's saying the law doesn't apply, because the law didn't come from God, it came from angels, right? It's as if, so the Bible's describing it, Yahweh is saying it, but Paul's told us that Yahweh didn't say it. It was the angels who said it. And there's no ascribing of any inspiration to them because they wouldn't be weak and beggarly and no gods, that we can just disregard their command to obey Sabbath, which basically is just rest on what we call Saturday. I mean, so Paul is pulling every plug out from underneath the law. And watch what Paul does to circumcision, which, by the way, was something that was done between Abraham and God. So this is before the law, actually, but it's a fundamental requirement of sons of Israel, but not of Gentiles. And I just want to point that out. There's a little note on the left side there that Gentiles don't have to do circumcision except for Passover. If they want to celebrate at someone's home, it's voluntary. If you want to celebrate Passover, you don't have to celebrate Passover, but if you do, you must be circumcised. This is in Exodus 12, verse 48. And that's, by the way, right at Mount Sinai, right at the time the Ten Commandments is being given. That command goes out. Also later, Ezekiel adds it prophetically that a Gentile who wished to enter the temple had to be circumcised. That's Ezekiel 44:9. There was a similar command in the tent of meeting in the era of the Sinai Ten Commandments. But just the easiest thing is to cite you over to Ezekiel. Okay, so what does Paul say about circumcision? Galatians 5:2-12. Let's read these words. Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Now, that's odd because he circumcised Timothy, so I guess Christ is no longer of any value to Timothy. Anyway, again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. Where's that in the law? The law has 30 commands against the Gentiles. If you start counting, there's the Ten Commandments, and there's about 20 scattered references to the sojourners having to do anything. And by the way, sometimes it says if you do this, then you have to do it the same way we do it. And people read that verse out of context and say, oh, see, you have to do everything that the law applies to you the same way it applies to everyone else. But actually, it's always in the context of those specific commands, like atonement. You didn't have to do atonement, but if you did it, you had to follow the same law, for there's only one law applicable in that instance. And anyway, so it goes on here. So you don't have to obey the whole law. 4, you who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. Wow, this is just by trying to be circumcised, trying to go to the temple, maybe have Passover. Wow, you have fallen away from grace. I mean, I've lost my salvation. And by the way, he teaches eternal security, but except for people who obey the law, they're lost. They're lost. If they're trying to go to a Passover Seder, they're lost for trying to get circumcised. They want to go to the temple. They're lost because they're trying to go to the temple and obey God's law. It's crazy. For through the Spirit we eagerly wait by faith the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. That's odd. Really kind of bizarre, isn't it? I mean, since these laws haven't been abrogated, oh, I guess they have. I guess Paul did that. So I guess he's more important than God. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. So that's, oh, I didn't know that's why we can get rid of the law, because we have faith. Faith in what? That's really the mystery, ladies and gentlemen. What does he believe is God? If he doesn't believe he wrote the law, which he said in Galatians earlier, that it came from angels who are weak and beggarly and not gods, we don't have to follow the Sabbath. Now we don't have to worry about circumcision because Paul says so, because we have faith. Anyway, the coup de grace, he ends off here, verse 12. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves, which basically meant to become eunuchs. I'll leave it at that. One of the most disgusting verses you'll read in the Bible. All right, I'm just going to briefly mention that there is somebody else who says the law came from angels, and that's allegedly Stephen. And Stephen is not a prophet. He's a deacon of the church. He's an early martyr. This is in Acts 7, verses 37 to 38 and 53. And he basically says, Moses was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living words to pass on to us. Verse 53, who have received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. So what? It doesn't insult, this version does not insult God, saying these are no gods and they're weak and beggarly, and basically that's why you don't have to follow Sabbath, because it was not given by God. That's the point of the passage. But here it's not taken that far. But the other thing is, this doesn't prove it's true just because somebody said it, and you have to then consider who's the likely source of this. I'm just going to tell you, Acts 22:20, Paul says, I was there with the people who were stoning Stephen, and I was holding their garments. And that's how he participated in the murder of Stephen. So it doesn't prove anything. If Paul told this story to Luke, and one more thing people need to know, Luke does not affirm inspiration for his book of Acts. He says in addressing Theophilus, the magistrate, in the first verse of Luke and the first verse of Acts, he tells in Luke, he says, I am relying upon reasonable witnesses who I believe are trustworthy. So he's accepting whatever Paul said. It doesn't prove it's true. It's just basically hearsay, and Luke trusted it. And hearsay is the worst kind of evidence. Luke is not telling you the story of Stephen from a first-person witness, meaning himself. Okay. So you can consider that whatever you will, but there's no biblical basis to say the law was ever given by angels at all. It's not in the Bible. It's not in the true Torah. Next, let's take a look at 1 Corinthians 6:12 and 10:23. Tell me if this is affirming the law or disaffirming the law. All things are lawful, but not all things are necessarily expedient. Expedient, by the way, means it's more expedient to do something if the costs are outweighed by the benefits. So you weigh the relative value of breaking a rule. So if Jesus says you're going to go to hell for false testimony, Paul's reading into it, well, if I think it's justified by the benefits to obtain, then it's okay. So that's how he lives his life. The next verse, all things are lawful for me. That's even worse. There's not even a test of expedience. I just do whatever I want. That's kind of like a person who has no moral conscience. Crazy. Okay, so here's another one we can ask. Does Paul affirm the Torah in this passage or disaffirm it as dead and gone? 2 Corinthians 3:6-11 in the ASV. Who also has made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. But if the ministration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away, how shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious? For if the ministration of condemnation be glory, much more does the ministration of righteousness exceed in glory. For even that which was made glorious had no glory in this respect, by reason of the glory that excels. For if that which is done away was glorious, much more that remains is glorious. So let's see. The law he's clearly referring to. He calls it engraven on stones. He's talking about the 2 tablets at the temple. So the letter kills, so that reading the Bible, reading the Torah will kill you. It's administration of death because of that. So you read it, it's going to kill you, and it's called administration of death. Written and engraven in stones, the 10 Commandments. It was glorious. It's no longer glorious. It has no glory now. Moses is an example of that. The glory he had was done away with. Therefore, it's administration of condemnation. Unlike Paul's letter to the Galatians, I don't see any condemnation in there. Do you? The administration of condemnation be glory, much more. But that glory has been done away with in the last part. Done away. It's no longer here. It's been done away, and it was glorious when it was here. So this is clearly a refutation of the law being valid anymore. So are we making any kind of mistake here, ascribing Paul deliberately lying in court to win a case himself? He knows he's got to get off on this case. By the way, I assume Luke is with him through this. How else could he know what's going on? Anyway, 2 Corinthians 12:16, Paul says, "But be it so, I did not myself burden you, but being crafty, I caught you with guile." Guile is deceit. What does the Bible think of that? Proverbs 12:10, "The Lord condemns a crafty man." Paul uses the same word crafty that God condemns. Really hard to understand why people don't question Paul. Then you got Romans 3:7. "For if the truth of God has more abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner?" So basically, you're saying, hey, I'm doing this for a good purpose, so why are you judging me as a sinner? The benefits outweighed the cost. I've given you this principle. Everything's lawful. You just decide if you want to accept the false testimony command or not. And if the benefits of lying are better, you just go with the benefits and you forget about the costs. They're not that big a deal. I mean, this is the rationale. But what does God say in Jeremiah 48:10 to that kind of thinking? "Cursed is he who does the work of the Lord deceitfully." All right, so what is the consequence of false testimony according to Jesus Christ? Even people who don't believe in Jesus know how to read the plain words on the page. This is Wikipedia false witness. According to the New Testament, Jesus explains that obedience to the prohibition against false testimony in court from the 10 Commandments is a requirement for eternal life. Wow. That's a big command. A big consequence if you don't follow it, Paul. Okay, so basically we've established another example of where Paul deliberately lies, says something that will help him get off on the case. Now, of course, Luke's okay with that because not that Luke even knows what Paul wrote to Galatians, but Paul clearly is okay with lying. But Luke is trying to win a case to keep Christianity legal. But why does Jesus? What's the purpose of the book of Acts for us? Remember, it was not written for us. But Jesus made sure it was preserved for us, and there's a good reason, because we can use it to test Paul and his validity. And that's why the book of Acts still exists, and it's still very important for Christians to study. But instead of studying it with blinders on, which is what your church tries to make sure you don't see any of this stuff and don't ask hard questions like I've shown you, they don't want you to do this test. This is the test from Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Matthew 7, verse 15 to 20. "Watch out for false prophets." Paul claims to be a prophet. Other people claim he's a prophet. "They come to you in sheep's clothing." That is, they claim to be Christian. "But inwardly they are ferocious or ravenous wolves." Jesus is quoting Genesis 49:27. Look it up. We have a video on that, the Benjamite wolf prophecy. Then Jesus says in verse 16, "By their fruits you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. Thus by their fruit you will recognize them." So we're supposed to use a fruit test for people who claim or people claim are a prophet. And that goes for Paul just as anybody else. And so did we apply a proper test to him? The answer is apparently not, because the evidence is consistently clear, overwhelming, and decisive, and very much from the book of Acts, which nobody can claim, I don't think, that Luke was deliberately trying to make Paul look bad. He was trying to make Paul look good to a pagan court which, by the way, necessitated him to put in the several facts I showed you before, the Python priestess, his remarks about the temple being God doesn't dwell there, and any temples made of human hands. I mean, these were facts which he knew would be embarrassing, or a Christian would take these as very terrible statements and unbiblical statements by Paul, but were necessary to try to win this case. And so what Luke had to do is redounded to our benefit, because Luke couldn't foresee that people would flock to Paul as they have by the modern era, that you literally have people who claim that Jesus belongs in a different dispensation and nothing he said is relevant, the dispensationalist doctrine. Anyway, God bless everybody. I hope this helped you. Hope it will help you in your walk with Christ, and just simply follow Jesus. It's not that hard. I mean, it is hard. It's a costly road, but it's, what I mean is, it isn't, nobody can force you to accept reading parts of the Bible that are not from God, and you can make a decision whether you believe Paul is from God or not just by testing the fruits of Paul. And you can do this, and you can obey Christ, which is what these are commands to you, to test the fruit of Paul, because he claims to be a prophet, right? So you have to obey Christ. So this is a moment of truth for everybody who's on the fence. You can use these videos and go test them. Go look it up. Look up if Luther said what I said. I gave you, that's why I put all these things on screen, so you can verify, and you can also look in the notes that go with the video. All right, God bless everybody. I hope this helps you. Ciao.